The term Chinese Freemasonry pops up, and you might picture some ancient offshoot of this very Western fraternal thing. But what if that whole picture is way off? Okay, let's unpack this, because today we're diving deep into the Chee Kung Tong, also known as the Hongmen, the vast family.
Right. And what's really interesting is that this Chinese Freemason label, which, really took hold in North America, it's actually kind of hidden in the fascinating and unique story of the Chee Kung Tong. So our mission today is really to get to the bottom of its real beginnings, how it spread across the globe, and why this Masonic mix-up even happened in the first place. We'll be looking closely at Antony Augay's recent article from Robert Burns Lodge number 59. It gives us a great overview based on some fresh research from 2024 and 2025.
Exactly. So we're going to explore everything from those legendary origin stories, think Shaolin monks and secret oaths and smoky back rooms, to their very real global footprint, their intricate inner world, and finally, how this whole Freemason thing even became a thing.
Here's where it gets good. Indeed. Let's journey back to the start. Many people are familiar with this really captivating tale, right? Shaolin monks, betrayed by a Qing emperor, often said to be Kangxi, leading to their temple being destroyed. And the story goes that 5 survivors found each other at the Red Flower Pavilion, formed the Tiandihui, and took this oath: overthrow the king, restore the Ming. It's a compelling piece of folklore, no doubt.
It really is. You can almost see the movie scene, the betrayal, the burning temple, that defiant oath. But then, historical records kind of tap you on the shoulder and say, actually.
Right. Exactly. When we actually dig into the Qing dynasty archives, a different picture starts to emerge. The evidence points to the Tiandihui, which was the organization before the Hongmen.
The precursor, yeah.
Being established around 1761, and not in some secret pavilion after a massacre, but in Fujian province, specifically at Guanyinting, the Goddess of Mercy Pavilion.
Guanyinting.
Okay. And the founders, not those legendary warrior monks, but a real monk named Shi, also known as Hong and some of his associates.
So, maybe not quite as dramatic as a Hollywood blockbuster then, but what was their real purpose in those early days, if not rebellion?
Well, interestingly, the early archival sources suggest their main focus wasn't this grand rebellion against the king. Not initially, anyway. Instead, it seems to have been more about something pretty fundamental: mutual aid and brotherhood. That famous slogan, Fan King Fu Ming, overthrow the king, restore the Ming, that actually appears to have come later, maybe around 1800, 1802, somewhere around the start of the 19th century.
Wow, that's really insightful. So the origin story itself actually evolved over time, maybe to galvanize support for later political aims.
That's a very plausible reading. It's a powerful lesson in how a group's narrative can be reshaped, to fit later goals.
Definitely. But what was the world like back then, in 18th century southern China? What created the need for a group like this in the first place?
Yeah, that's crucial context. Southern China at that time, especially Fujian and Guangdong, was under considerable socioeconomic pressure. You had a rapidly growing population, increasing competition for land, widespread economic hardship.
Sounds tough.
It was, and this led to a lot of internal migration, creating this mobile population, people often disconnected from traditional family and community support structures. Historians even describe a kind of frontier culture or bachelor culture in some regions where those traditional lineage systems were weaker.
So you have all these people on the move, maybe feeling adrift, without those usual safety nets, family, community, gone.
Precisely. These were often marginalized individuals facing a lot of insecurity. And, maybe ironically, the Qing government's attempts to suppress dissent by banning secret societies might have actually pushed people towards these underground groups.
So it sort of backfired.
It might have. It certainly created fertile ground for organizations that could offer that missing sense of belonging and support.
And that's where the early Tiandihui stepped in. Not as revolutionaries, but as this kind of informal grassroots support network.
Exactly. Think of it almost like a poor man's huiguan, those native place associations. But this one catered specifically to the lower rungs of society.
Who are we talking about? Like farmers? Laborers?
Yeah, farmers, laborers, traveling peddlers. People really just focused on getting by, on survival. They provided financial help when times were tough, assistance with big life events like weddings and funerals, maybe a degree of protection for travelers, and importantly, a strong sense of belonging through this idea of fictive kinship, essentially creating family bonds where none existed by blood.
So it was really about having someone's back in a tough world. But the article also mentions, that their activity sometimes crossed over into illegal areas.
That's a really important nuance to grasp. Within a marginalized population, often struggling just to survive, some early activities did sometimes include things like, well, robbery and extortion. But it's important to see this probably less as modern organized crime and more as maybe desperate measures for economic survival when other options weren't there.
Right. Context is key. Okay, so from these localized beginnings, focused on mutual support, the Hongmen then somehow grew into this massive worldwide network. How did that happen?
Well, the 19th century was the real turning point. It was fueled by these massive waves of migration out of southern China. You had the economic hardship, the political instability within China, and then the draw of opportunities overseas, think California gold rush, things like that. It led to huge numbers of people leaving Fujian and Guangdong.
And wherever they went, this sense of brotherhood, this Hongmen idea, it went with them.
Remarkably so, we see lodges springing up all across the globe. North America, San Francisco, around 1849, 1850 maybe?
It's a gold rush area.
Canada, in Barkerville, British Columbia, by 1863. That lodge later actually became the Hongmen Chee Kung Tong, and then they spread to Southeast Asia, Australia, Latin America, even parts of Europe and Africa. It was truly global.
Wow, that's an incredibly rapid expansion. What allowed them to spread so quickly? Was there like a central plan?
That's the interesting thing. Probably not a central plan. A key factor was their decentralized structure. Basically, any member who had gone through the initiation could potentially start a new chapter just by teaching the rituals and symbols.
No need for approval from HQ, so to speak.
Exactly. No need for permission from some central authority. That made them incredibly adaptable to the movement of these migrant communities.
So these lodges then became absolutely crucial for these overseas Chinese communities who were often facing really difficult circumstances, right? Discrimination, isolation.
Absolutely vital. Yeah, imagine arriving in a new country, facing all that isolation, discrimination, economic hardship. The CKT lodges became lifelines. They provided essential mutual aid financial support if you were sick or unemployed, help covering funeral costs, assistance finding work, or maybe a place to live.
So much more than just a social club.
Oh, much more. They often served as the main social hubs, the cultural anchors in these new and sometimes pretty unwelcoming lands. I mean, in some cases, they were the only formal Chinese organizations available to people.
Wow. And they were a fundamental support system in what could be a hostile environment.
Precisely. They also offered a measure of protection against anti-Chinese violence and discriminatory laws. And they even acted as informal dispute resolution bodies.
Like a community court.
Kind of, yeah. Mediating conflicts within the community when maybe access to the local legal system was difficult or biased against them.
Okay, let's dig into that inner world then. The rituals, the structure, the core ideology that held it all together.
Right. So the basic unit was the local lodge, the Tong. And as we said initially, they were very independent, very autonomous. While they didn't have a strong central command early on, they did develop leadership roles. President, vice president, secretary, treasurers, particularly in places like North America. You'd sometimes see symbolic ranks mentioned on their banners, maybe vaguely echoing ancient Chinese hierarchies, giving a sense of internal status.
And over time, did these individual lodges start to connect more, like form bigger networks?
Yes, they did, especially from the late 19th century onwards. Increased migration, better communication, that all played a role. Plus the efforts of certain leaders to foster greater unity. You see things like those international conferences held in San Francisco in the 1920s.
Right, 1923, 1925.
Yeah, those were significant attempts to really solidify this idea of a global sworn brotherhood.
Now, the initiation rituals, they sound quite intense. Symbolic journeys, blood oaths.
They were designed to be deeply transformative, yeah. You had things like the ceremonial washing, wearing white robes. This symbolized purity, but also mourning for their legendary martyrs and a kind of rebirth into the brotherhood. The person being initiated would undergo symbolic trials, pass through different gates within the lodge.
Like a test?
Exactly. Eventually being brought before an altar dedicated to Guan Yu Quan Kong, the revered god of loyalty. And there they would take these very solemn oaths.
And then comes this really powerful act, the blood oath. Tell us about that.
Yes, it's a very potent symbol of commitment, isn't it? Typically, a white rooster or chicken would be sacrificed, its blood collected, sometimes mixed with wine, and then everyone present would drink from this shared cup. It created this incredibly visceral, seemingly unbreakable bond, a kind of quasi-familial tie forged in blood.
Wow. Beyond these intense rituals, they also had this whole secret world, didn't they? Symbols, codes, often hard to remember.
Probably. But they did. The triad heaven, earth, man was fundamental. It was reflected even in their names, like Tiandihui and Sanhehui, the Three Harmonies Society.
Very cool.
Yeah, the number 3 itself held significance in passwords, recognition signals. They use secret handshakes, coded language, even subtle arrangements of everyday objects, like how you place your teacups could signal you were a member.
A whole hidden language woven into daily life. Amazing. So what were the core values that held all this together? What did they emphasize?
At its heart, it was really about Xiangdi brotherhood, unwavering mutual loyalty, and this strong sense of yi righteousness or justice. These weren't just abstract ideals, you know. They were practical necessities for survival in the often unforgiving environments these people face.
And Guan Yu was the embodiment of that.
Exactly. Guan Yu served as the ultimate symbol of these virtues: loyalty, righteousness, courage.
And their ideology, it wasn't just invented out of thin air, right? You mentioned they drew inspiration from popular Chinese stories.
Oh, absolutely. Tales like Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin, Outlaws of the Marsh, stories filled with sworn brotherhoods, righteous rebellion against injustice. These resonated deeply.
Makes sense.
Religiously, they had a kind of syncretic blend, incorporating elements from Buddhism, Taoism, various folk beliefs. You might see altars with figures representing different spiritual traditions side by side. And politically, as we touched on, their stance evolved from being largely apolitical, maybe focused just on local survival, to eventually embracing that anti-Qing sentiment, which really solidified in the early 19th century. Later on, of course, Sun Yat-sen strategically connected their history to this broader narrative of long-standing patriotic resistance.
Right. Which leads us perfectly into their historical impact. It seems really significant, especially when we talk about the 1911 revolution.
Absolutely crucial. Indispensable, really. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was very savvy. He recognized the CKT's widespread presence, especially within the overseas Chinese communities. He deliberately cultivated relationships with them. There are reports he even became a member himself in a lodge in Honolulu around 1904.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah, and he used their networks as platforms to disseminate his revolutionary ideas and, critically, to raise the essential funds needed for his movement.
And those financial contributions, they were a real game changer. Not just pocket change.
Oh, absolutely indispensable. Sun's various uprisings required significant financial backing for weapons, supplies, logistics. The CKT network, particularly those overseas branches, really stepped up. For instance, branches in Canada are said to have actually mortgaged their properties to raise funds.
Mortgage their buildings.
Yeah. Donations poured in from members across North America, Southeast Asia, Hawaii, even places like Cuba. It was a truly global fundraising effort, driven by this shared sense of brotherhood and, by then, political purpose.
But the relationship wasn't always smooth sailing after the Republic was established in 1912, was it?
No, there were definitely tensions later on. Some CKT leaders felt their contributions weren't properly acknowledged by the new government. And there were ideological differences that emerged between them and Sun's Kuomintang, the KMT. But despite those complexities, their support for the revolution remains a really significant defining chapter in their history.
Definitely. And beyond the revolution, we need to remember that vital role as a mutual aid society, especially for those living abroad in the diaspora.
Yes, that was such a core function for so many of them for so long. They provided that absolutely crucial social safety net for immigrants facing all kinds of hardship and discrimination: financial assistance, help with funeral arrangements, temporary shelter, job placement help, community centers, even sometimes establishing schools.
Yeah.
It was really about looking after their own in a foreign land.
But we also can't ignore the other side of the coin, the connection that some branches had with organized crime. Those Tong wars we hear about in American Chinatowns, for example.
Right. It's a complex and sometimes, uncomfortable part of their history. The term Tong itself, especially in the U.S., became this very broad label. It got slapped onto everything from legitimate CKT branches and benevolent societies to outright criminal groups.
And triad.
Triad was initially a term used by the British colonial authorities, and it sort of became this catch-all for Chinese secret societies, often carrying these negative criminal connotations.
So it's crucial not to paint all CKT lodges with the same brush. Not every branch was involved in crime.
Not at all.
No.
Absolutely not. But you have to understand the context. Within these marginalized communities facing significant discrimination, limited economic opportunities, some groups affiliated with the CKT did become involved in illicit economies, things like gambling, opium trade, prostitution, the Tong Wars in places like American Chinatowns in the late 19th, early 20th century. Those were often turf battles, competition over control of these illicit activities. It really highlights the diverse paths these organizations took in different contexts.
Okay, that context really helps us understand why that Chinese Freemason label is, well, so misleading. Where did that name even come from? How did it stick?
Yeah, it's a key question. The name really started gaining popularity in North America, late 19th, early 20th century. And the Vancouver CKT branch actually officially adopted it in 1920. The precise reasons aren't perfectly documented, but we can make some educated guesses based on the historical situation.
I mean, superficial similarities must have played a role at the start, right? Secret rituals, passwords.
Most likely, yeah. Early Western observers saw the secrecy, the initiation ceremonies, the passwords, and they drew comparisons to what they knew Western Freemasonry. But as we now understand, those similarities are largely just on the surface. They don't run deep.
But was there maybe also a strategic element for them to adopt that name in Western societies?
Well, almost certainly. You have to think Western Freemasonry, back then especially, was generally seen as a respectable, established fraternal organization. It had civic connections, a certain legitimacy. So, by associating themselves with that name, the CKT branches in Western countries might have hoped to gain some of that respectability, improve their public image, maybe make it easier to navigate interactions with the dominant culture.
So it's like a form of cultural adaptation, finding a familiar box to put themselves in.
Exactly. It was strategic. Ultimately, that Chinese Freemason label tells us more about the Chee Kung Tong's need to adapt and survive in Western society than it does about any real shared history or purpose with actual Freemasonry.
So it was much more about borrowing some of that perceived respectability than any genuine connection between the two traditions.
Precisely. When you actually compare them at their core, the differences are fundamental. Look at their origins. CKT in 18th century southern China, born from mutual aid needs of the marginalized. Western Freemasonry evolving from European stonemason guilds and Enlightenment clubs. Totally different roots.
And they're focused.
CKT emphasized brotherhood, loyalty, mutual protection, often with political dimensions intertwined. Western Freemasonry focuses more on moral improvement, allegorical teachings, a kind of non-sectarian spirituality, usually requiring belief in a supreme being.
Even the rituals sound completely different. Blood oaths versus allegorical plays.
Right. CKT rituals involve things like the blood oath, veneration of Guan Yu, drawing heavily on Chinese culture. Western Freemasonry uses allegorical plays often based on the Bible or Solomon's Temple, using stonemasons' tools as symbols.
Organizationally, too.
Very different. CKT was traditionally decentralized, flexible, no formal system of degrees like in Masonry. Western Freemasonry has a much stricter lodge system, grand lodges, the 3 degrees, standardized progression.
And politics.
Huge difference. CKT was historically deeply involved in rebellion and revolution, explicitly anti-Qing for a long time. Western Freemasonry officially maintains neutrality on partisan politics, even forbidding political discussion within lodges. They're just fundamentally different beasts.
So fast forward to today. What's the Chee Kung Tong like now? Have they largely faded away?
Well, the 1911 revolution was a massive turning point, as we said. Their main political objective in China was achieved, which led to a kind of existential question for the organization. What now? And this led to some fragmentation, different paths. Some groups within China did unfortunately become more involved in illicit activities, contributing to the lineage of modern triads. However, many overseas branches largely did the opposite. They reverted back to their foundational principles: fraternalism, mutual aid, community service. They also had to navigate the complexities of the Chinese Civil War later on, which added another layer.
And in our current 21st century, are they still around?
Oh yes, they still maintain a global presence, potentially hundreds of thousands of members, maybe across something like 180 branches worldwide. They still hold international conferences occasionally, keeping those global connections alive.
And what's their focus now, mainly?
In many diaspora communities, think Canada, the US, Australia, their focus tends to be very much on fostering fellowship among members, preserving their cultural heritage, engaging in community activities, and supporting charitable causes, scholarships, disaster relief, community events. And their historic lodge buildings, they often stand as important landmarks in Chinatowns, real reminders of the crucial role they played supporting Chinese immigrants over the decades.
What about their political role today? Does that still exist?
It's quite varied, depends heavily on the location. In Taiwan, for instance, they are legally recognized and still have some political influence, partly due to those historical ties with the Kuomintang.
And in mainland China?
It's different. A faction reorganized way back in 1925 as the China Zigong Party. Today, that party is aligned with the Communist Party. It's one of the 8 legally recognized minor democratic parties. It sums partly as a link between the PRC and the Chinese diaspora.
Wow. So a really multifaceted legacy then,
Yeah.
contradictory even, from providing that essential mutual aid for immigrants
Yeah, a vital safety net.
to being a patriotic force in the birth of modern China, preserving culture overseas, but also having those complicated connections, in some cases, to criminal activities.
Precisely. It's all part of their complex story. And while their prominence or visibility might have decreased in some areas, due to assimilation, better social conditions, the rise of other community organizations, they absolutely continue to exist. They exist in various forms, largely adapting more towards community service and cultural preservation now. Their aging membership is a challenge. Sure, attracting younger generations isn't always easy for fraternal groups, but they remain a testament to the enduring power of these transnational fraternal ties.
Okay, so the big takeaway here really is that the Chee Kung Tong, the Hongmen, it's this incredibly complex, evolving brotherhood, deep roots in Chinese history, the global diaspora experience.
Yeah.
It's just so much richer and more nuanced than simply calling it Chinese Freemasonry.
Absolutely. That label just doesn't capture it. Its real origins lie in those 18th century needs for mutual support among marginalized people in China. That's quite different from those romanticized myths of immediate revolutionary purpose. And its significant role, its crucial role in supporting diaspora communities worldwide. Plus, its notable, though sometimes complex, contributions to the 1911 revolution. Those are undeniable parts of the story.
It really underscores the importance, doesn't it, of looking beyond those easy labels to truly understand the unique cultural, historical, social forces that shaped this distinctly Chinese institution, this vast family, as they call it, of sworn brothers navigating centuries of really profound change.
And maybe this raises a really interesting point for you, the listener, to consider. Given the CKT's long and adaptable history of providing mutual support, what role might similar kinds of fraternal organizations, maybe new ones, play today? In addressing the contemporary global challenges faced by marginalized communities all over the world, it's definitely some food for thought.